In the winter of 1905, a group of exiled revolutionaries gathered in a dimly lit cafe in Berlin. Among them was Maulvi Barkatullah, an Islamic scholar from British-ruled South Asia, who had become a global agitator against imperialism. That year, Japan's defeat of Russia, the first time an Asian power had humbled a European empire, sent shockwaves through colonial worlds. To Maulvi Barkatullah, this moment presented a revolutionary possibility. The fusion of anti-colonial resistance, Islamic solidarity, and socialist critique into a unified narrative against Western domination. For intellectuals like Barkatullah, this moment demonstrated that Western dominance was neither inevitable nor permanent. As European empires reached the zenith of their global dominance, a coalition of Islamic scholars, socialist intellectuals, and nationalist firebrands began constructing a shared language of resistance. Few figures represent this ideological ferment more completely than Maulvi Barkatullah, the South Asian revolutionary whose life and work bridged continents, faiths, and political traditions. His story reveals how anti-colonial movements drew upon religious identity, class consciousness, and nationalist aspiration to create a powerful challenge to imperial rule. It is a process that continues to influence global politics today. Born in 1854 in the princely state of Bhopal, Barkatullah received a traditional Islamic education at the famed Darul Uloom Deoband seminary, where scholars were already developing critiques of British rule through Islamic legal frameworks. However, Barkatullah's perspective expanded dramatically with the devastating human costs of colonial capitalism during the famines of the 1890s, which killed millions, while British authorities continued exporting Indian grain to global markets. This experience marked a turning point, pushing Barkatullah beyond purely religious resistance towards an economic analysis of imperialism that would eventually incorporate elements of Marxist thought. His intellectual journey is similar to that of other radical anti-colonial thinkers of the period, who recognized that national liberation required both cultural assertion and socio-economic transformation. Barkatullah's engagement with Japan represents a fascinating chapter in the history of anti-colonial thought, when Asian revolutionaries were inspired by Japan's achievements in modernization and for a while looked towards a Pan-Asian model for the liberation of their foreign-ruled lands. In fact, Barkatullah's arrival in Tokyo in 1903 coincided with Japan's dramatic emergence as the first non-Western imperial power capable of defeating a European state, a development that electrified intellectuals from colonized lands across Asia. Hired to teach Urdu at Tokyo Imperial University, Barkatullah found himself at the epicenter of what might be called the Japanese moment in global anti-colonialism, when Asian revolutionaries from India to Vietnam looked to Japan as both inspiration and potential ally. The significance of Japan in Barkatullah's political evolution cannot be overstated. While later Asian revolutionaries would critique Japan's own imperial ambitions, Barkatullah during this period saw in the Meiji state a model of successful non-Western modernization that avoided either wholesale westernization or reactionary traditionalism. He became busy with a careful study of how Japan had maintained its cultural autonomy while developing the military and industrial capacity to resist European domination, precisely the balance he sought for Muslim societies under colonial rule. This perspective placed his views in a dialogue with other Asian intellectuals then in Tokyo, including the young Vietnamese nationalist Phan and the Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, with whom he developed a particularly close intellectual relationship. Barkatullah's activities in Japan extended far beyond academic circles. He became deeply involved with the Pan-Asian Society, a transnational network of activists who saw Japan's victory over Russia as heralding a new era of Asian solidarity. His 1905 pamphlet, The Sword, printed in both English and Japanese, articulated a vision of Islamic revival as part of this broader Asian awakening against Western imperialism. What made his argument distinctive was its synthesis of Islamic rhetoric with the language of anti-colonial internationalism. He presented Japan's triumph not just as a national achievement, but as a civilizational turning point for all oppressed peoples. This perspective attracted the attention of Japanese Pan-Asianists like Toyama Mitsuru, who saw in Barkatullah a potential bridge to Muslim populations under British rule. The British government's growing alarm at Barkatullah's influence led to intense diplomatic pressure on Japan to expel him. The 1905 Anglo-Japanese alliance, which aligned British and Japanese interests against Russia, created particularly delicate circumstances for anti-British activists in Japan. Barkatullah's eventual expulsion from Japan in 1914, after more than a decade of teaching and organizing, revealed the limits of Japan's willingness to support anti-colonial movements that threatened its relations with Western powers. Yet even after leaving Japan, Barkatullah maintained connections with Japanese Pan-Asianists and continued to reference the Japanese model in his later writings. Barkatullah's Japanese interlude represents more than just a biographical episode. It illuminates a crucial transitional moment when anti-colonial movements began imagining alternatives to the Eurocentric world order. His attempts to connect Islamic revivalism with Japanese-inspired Pan-Asianism created ideological frameworks that would later influence figures as diverse as Indonesian nationalist Sukarno and Indian revolutionary Subhas Chandra Bose. Perhaps most importantly, his experience in Japan demonstrates how colonized intellectuals actively participated in global intellectual exchanges, reworking ideas from diverse sources to craft their own visions of liberation. The outbreak of the First World War provided Barkatullah with an opportunity to translate theory into action. Recognizing that the conflict between European powers created openings for colonial subjects, he joined the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin, a revolutionary group supported by Germany as part of its efforts to undermine British rule abroad. Here, Barkatullah worked alongside an extraordinary array of radicals, including Irish Republicans, German socialists, and fellow Indian nationalists. His most significant contribution during this period was a 1915 fatwa titled Jihad Against England, which reinterpreted Islamic concepts of just warfare through the lens of anti-colonial struggle. The document represented a remarkable ideological innovation, framing resistance to British rule as both a religious obligation and a revolutionary act against global capitalist exploitation. The fusion of Islamic and socialist rhetoric would later influence liberation movements across the Muslim world. Barkatullah's activism took him across continents and into contact with diverse revolutionary traditions. After being expelled from Japan under British pressure, he spent several years in the United States editing the Islamic Fraternity, a newspaper that drew explicit connections between the struggles of colonized Indians, oppressed African Americans, and exploited industrial workers. His writings during this period displayed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how racial, religious, and class oppression intersected under imperialism. American surveillance files from the time reveal how seriously authorities took his influence. The Russian Revolution of 1917 added another dimension to Barkatullah's evolving worldview. We can guess that Barkatullah's first encounter with socialist ideas probably occurred during his years in Japan, where he would have likely interacted with exiled Russian revolutionaries and Japanese socialists, who were then translating Marxist texts into Asian languages. However, it was during his wartime exile in Berlin from 1914 to 1918 that he developed concrete collaborations with Marxist revolutionaries through the Indian Independence Committee. This unlikely alliance, which brought together Islamic scholars like Barkatullah, Hindu nationalists, and avowed Marxists such as Virendranath Chattopadhyay, showed the pragmatism and flexibility of early communist anti-imperialism. The Bolshevik publication of secret Allied treaties exposing European colonial ambitions in 1917 would have resonated with Barkatullah, who saw in Lenin's attacks on Western imperialism a validation of his own views. What distinguished Barkatullah's approach was his insistence on framing socialist concepts within Islamic theological frameworks. His 1918 manifesto, The Call to Jihad, published in Kabul, made the striking argument that Islam's prohibition of usury and mandate for wealth redistribution anticipated Marxist critiques of capitalism. This intellectual strategy would presented socialism not as a foreign import, but as the modern expression of Islamic economic justice, would later become central to post-colonial liberation movements across the Muslim world. Barkatullah wrote, "The time has come for Asiatic nations to understand the noble principles of Russian socialism and to embrace it seriously and enthusiastically. They should, without loss of time, send their children to Russian schools to learn modern sciences, noble arts, practical physics." Such views led to his involvement with the Provisional Government of India, a government in exile established in Kabul with support from both Bolshevik Russia and Afghanistan's newly independent ruler Amanullah Khan. As Prime Minister of this symbolic administration, Barkatullah attempted to put his theories into practice, issuing manifestos that called for the simultaneous overthrow of British rule in India and India's feudal landowning class. His vision for a post-colonial India combined Islamic principles of social justice with radical land reform and workers' rights. It was a program that anticipated many later experiments in post-colonial state building. Barkatullah's final years were disappointing in some ways and promising in others. The gradual stabilization of British rule in India after the First World War, combined with Mustafa Kemal's abolition of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, took down two central pillars of his revolutionary strategy. Yet, even as his immediate political projects faltered, his ideas continued circulating through anti-colonial networks. South Asian communists cited his works, while Indonesian nationalists were inspired by his attempts to reconcile Islamic thought with modern political radicalism. When Barkatullah died in San Francisco in 1927, his funeral brought together an extraordinary cross-section of activists and intellectuals, proof of his ability to bridge disparate communities of resistance. The significance of Barkatullah's life and work extends far beyond his individual achievements. He represents an important but often overlooked tradition of anti-colonial thought that sought to synthesize religious identity with radical economic critique. In an era when political movements are frequently categorized as either religious or secular, nationalist or socialist, Barkatullah's life and era remind us that these boundaries were once far more fluid. His attempt to articulate an Islamic framework for socialist revolution anticipated later developments from the non-aligned movement to liberation theology. Perhaps most importantly, his career demonstrates how intellectuals from colonized lands actively participated in global ideological debates, rather than simply reacting to Western political thought. Today, as a new generation thinks about the complex relationship between religion and revolution in the global South, Barkatullah's legacy offers valuable insights.